Welcome back, everybody. Paul L. is asking, uh, returning us to the question of copying, and it's an excellent question again about master copies. I guess there are multiple studies one can do related to a skill or attribute of a master work that you as a student can do. So we're talking doing studies. Would it be a wise practice to do color studies of someone like Degas or Monet, and perhaps a separate study of line, contour, form from a different master, like Ingres, for instance? Would you advise against using master copies for such particular skills, or separating aspects of a work like that? In other words, do you use master copies to try and encompass learning from all the elements of a picture? Color, line, form, composition, etc., rather than the kind of piecemeal approach that I inquired about above. Like it. I like the question. I think you're already on to the self-evident, Paul. You're asking questions that you probably should, in a sense of what makes sense to you. You probably should. You're not going to hear something from me that will surprise you. And I'm hoping that that's, by the way, all my content is like that, because I'm not operating from a book. I'm not operating from a philosophy, written in a document somewhere that I'm trying to be the authority about. I'm not a priest of the of the form, whatever Ang thinks about that. So. Although I suspect, well, let's not get into that. There's all sorts of fun ways to think about what your real role is. Viz God, viz as teachers and that sort of thing. You do have responsibilities, but I think the greatest responsibility you have as a teacher is to get people to use their common sense, use their eyes to look at nature and pictures, and think through best practices. What has been producing results for you? Probably in terms of learning your trade. I would argue that the worst thing you can do is simply copy people. One person, like just copy. Let's just copy Sargent all day long. Let's just figure out Sargent. I'm not a fan of that approach. Partly because I have too much, I guess you could say, individuality, too much pride in the uniqueness of myself, And I don't mean that in a boastful or prideful way. I mean that in the sense that we have a mission to fulfill. We have a duty to fulfill our mission, our personal one, which is not to imitate other people. So I'm not a fan of copying somebody extensively just because. You're going to wind up being a version of them, in my thought. And I don't do that with the Boston School. I never have, by the way. As I said, I was just looking for best practices to get to a good likeness that incorporated all color and light and all the rest of those things, form, that we respect, that you yourself learn to respect, or in my case, I should say that I learned to respect over time, looking at nature and looking at pictures. So let's just look at a few pictures together, and I'll come back to this question because it's got enough different things to talk about. But, well, actually, let me answer some superficial version of the question first. Would it be wise to practice to do color studies of someone like Degas or Monet, and perhaps a separate study of line, contour, form from a different master like Ingres, for instance? So there you are. You're in my sense of it. You're answering your own question. You're taking, as Gammell would say, you're borrowing from millionaires, but all painters aren't millionaires in every aspect of the form. And it's a funny thing to say, but we are trying to be, I guess, masters of the latest and greatest skills, right? As a platform, just as a takeoff point for what we do with them, in the process of making our pictures or expressing our sense of life, as Ayn Rand would put it. So would you advise against using master copies for such particular skills, or separating aspects of a work like that? So you'll hear that I do. So in other words, do you use master copies to try and encompass learning from all the elements of a picture? And again, I don't recommend copying Ang, just learn every little thing he does. You can do it, but life's short. And and you'll find, by the way, I think Reynolds, everybody who's made comments about it, I think even Degas, but certainly Ang, are talking about not making these slavish copies. And that's what that would become. I'm going to copy these three sergeants, I'm going to copy them from one end to the other and just see what I can get out of it. You can do that. I mean, and I'm not going to say one can't get information that way. But that's one of the reasons I want people to actually, and I consider what happened to me to be very, very fortunate, and that is that, and this is what I recommend, and that is that people paint from life and paint from life and paint from life. And gradually start looking at masters, look for information about how, and you'll see how people handled things and how they handled them better than you did. But in the interest, I would say your reason you're looking at the masters to see how they how they handled life, the truth of the world in front of them. So there's your wisdom, right? Let's look at pictures. The first guy, this is the first picture I looked at. Once I became a student of R.H. Ives Gammell, it's the first picture I looked at because I was told to go look at Chardin to answer a question of how to handle edges, edge work, you'd say. And so what we had been doing, we'd been painting between the lines up to that point, and I was wondering when we were going to paint the nuanced shifts and that sort of thing. And in the course of asking Mr. Gammell, his answer to me, it was very much an academic answer, was, you can fix those up later. But then he sent me to Chardin, and what I found with Chardin was that he was incorporating them, obviously incorporating them from the beginning, the painterly model. And you can see it in the work here, which is one of the pieces at the MFA that we were looking at. So I commend that to you for one reason, edges. Now, what I'm going to do with this little video is I'm just going to go through a whole bunch of different painters and suggest something you might like to use them for. And just suggest to you that this will give you some better idea of how I think of copying. Okay? So edges, right? Now, I could learn other stuff from Chardin. Chardin organizes stuff intelligently. And so you could talk about the furniture arrangement in his pictures and learn something from him. But doing one, you'd copy differently from doing the other, right? In other words, if you're trying to figure out how he organizes stuff, you might do a line cartoon thumbnail of this thing if you wanted to sort of understand his grouping mindset. But if you want to study his edges, you're going to have to copy some section or sections that has some significant edge handling, so you can deal with it. It might be a section like as big as this or something. Something you find where he's had to deal with many different kinds of edges. And so you follow what I'm saying, that and I've said before in the previous video about copying, I mentioned that you want to go to do your copies with an idea in mind of what you're trying to get from this guy. What has he got to give you? Famously, Veronese has color to give you. He's considered by so many to be the greatest colorist of all time. And and you can see actually the beauty of his color. It's more organized more beautifully organized in my view than Titian's. Doesn't mean his color is more beautiful than Titian's, but it's remarkably organized. And what I mean to show you, and again, I'm not going to copy this whole dang picture with 100 people in it or so to understand color combinations, right? Now you might copy, if you wanted to copy this whole thing to understand his color scheme here. Now if you see this in person, it's mind-blowingly beautiful as a color scheme. The color scheme is something you would look at from back further back. The color scheme is all the relationships of the colors weaving in and out and setting off each other and all this stuff. But but that's a writ large sort of model. The color scheme is writ large. It might include the distribution, for example, of greens that we've talked about before, like this sort of thing, green, 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 and the distribution where you'll find these greens continually picking up through a picture. Well, that's a compositional question, right? So if you want to handle Veronese with the question of how he composes with color, that's another story. But the idea of a color scheme, I say finding the colors, the color play of the big impression, and it's very true. I found about Veronese. His work looks beautiful in color from a good distance. I'm trying to think where the one is I've seen more recently. I think it's at the Gardner Museum in Boston. That's true of good people who have a sense of color. So do it. You can do that But I'm going to show you these close-ups. And the crazy thing is about these things, the first thing that's so obvious is that they are combinations of gold and blue, for example, that are remarkably nice together. And but you'll see that the neighborhood has pickups of some of the same notes, the same reds, the same blues, the same golds. So these things form up almost like paintings in themselves in sections that are different from the whole. And he does that repeatedly. This one, it's this particular kind of green, and there's Degas saying, what's more beautiful than the two different values of the same color side by side? He probably picked that up by watching Veronese. He probably looked at Veronese and saw that. Maybe it was that sleeve. But this combination of green and yellow plus those and those particular oranges, you can see that they obviously, as it were, go together. Every orange isn't going to be right for that green. Every red, every whatever. So you see, it's a whole thing is a warm set of those kinds of notes. And in this one, it's a similar kind of thing. That if you look at this orange here and that blue, you have a beautiful, beautiful combination. And the overall color scheme is also very pleasing in the sense that it's sort of an orange color scheme. These spots, these blues around, or golds, or whatever. But it's a reddish, warmish, whatever color scheme. This one is further up, the balcony above these people. But again, there you are looking at a picture that looks like it could have been a whole painting unto itself. Notice how he's scheming again with some of the same notes here, with the greens into the orange and the yellows. But just whether we talk about individually what things are happening, you can see that this thing feels like it's coloristically of a piece. And I possibly could have left this guy out to make it even feel more so. But the intrigue of Veronese is serious. But is this about beauty? And that's the thing that happens with when you get out of the North Country, you start getting down. And I want to say it was Alfred Stebbins who said that to see color, you have to be in the South or something like that. It isn't what he said, but I'm sure he was talking about Titian and those guys down, not in Florence, but down in the Venetian painters. So that, if you're going to go to him, you might be wanting to go and study colors. Look at this thing and just copy some of these colors. You wouldn't go in there and want to draw the beards and the eyes and all this sort of thing if you're trying to understand his color. You follow that? That'd be a colossal waste of time. And you'll see, as I said before in the last one we talked about this, you'll find color studies by several different people, no less than Chardin and Degas, that are very small. They're clearly very small, maybe even as small as 6 inches square or something like that. And they're just essentially blobs. You can tell what the painting is, but you can see that they're just worked on that way. And by the way, I'm saying again, this is not going to be definitive what I'm doing here. I'm just suggesting to you a single reason why you might approach these guys and why you might copy some part of their picture. In the case of Degas, again, it's the color scheme writ large that I'm suggesting one would go and copy him for. So to get the color values, so the dark spots down here and the colors there, but the red, the greens that keep on showing up again up here, you're trying to copy this. You'd probably want to copy the whole painting to get the hang of how that's working, because that is what this one is, right? You could argue this is a purple with greens in it and a green with purples in it as a basis. And then all of these rich variations of those kinds of things, plus some extras, when you start talking about these blues, perhaps, because we're not looking at the real painting and who knows what really is in this thing. But you follow, we have that possibility here because it's a beautiful color scheme. But it also shows you distribution of color, like the greens picking up, and little bitty hat over here picking up again. And the movements through different kinds of reds that are very related to each other, pinks to reds, whatever, and all the way through all this sort of stuff. And so what you learn from this guy is how he plays those games. You'll notice the play from chroma into weaker versions of the same note, or how he does that intermittently and that sort of thing, as well as the pleasing quality of the general color scheme. And the same on the right. The pastels are both, the one on the left looks like a pastel. I'm quite sure it is. The one on the right is definitely a pastel. Now, the one on the right you could look at for other things. It's showing you could think about this one as a way of thinking about composition. You see this is essentially is like a body with an arm sticking out, right? So a body with an arm sticking out. And you can see how this guy creates rhymes out of if you want to call them rhymes, correlations, but they're formal correlations, right? Correlations of form. So you could do thumbnails to study that and copy that. None of this copying stuff, I don't recommend it. I don't see a reason to take long times to do it. It's just conceptual. You're trying to get the idea of what he's doing. And that would be true in every category, every single one of these things. Try to understand, whichever little part of it you pick, and don't copy any longer than to have played with this. The copying thing, by the way, puts you in front of a painting longer, for sure, than you would otherwise be there. And that in itself is a good thing. But I am trying to direct you to, why are you copying? What is it about this guy in particular that you're working on now? And I haven't found that just copying Degas in general. You'd have to copy everybody who's a good painter. And so I am saying that you want to have your list of things that you value. Do you value beautiful color schemes? Well, then look at the guys who do it. Not everybody does it. I'm talking about singing ones. I'm not talking about, most painters in the Western art have colors that aren't implausible together, right? But to have colors that dance and sing and make song and make music, that puts you in a different class of guys, right? Sometimes whistlers, sometimes some others. Yeah, but do know what you're there for. And somebody else mentioned the idea of Ang, and I didn't bring Ang into this one because I'm not being, definitive. I'm not trying to do the whole thing, but talking about Ang and his amazing attention to line and the way he makes line play, just the way Degas makes color play, line music, you would have to say. And so that's just like in the organization of a frilly sleeve. Or the folds in a dress. It's spectacularly of that ilk. Copy a section of something like that, even if it's just a sleeve on Madame Husson, was that her name? It almost comes to me. It doesn't though. Now this is a Monet. Why would you copy a Monet? Well, one reason is because almost nobody has ever painted the fullness of the spectrum of an outdoor day with that sense of light the way he has. And so you'd go to copy him, and you might copy a whole thing. You get enough notes on there to cover the field so you can see the kinds of qualities of chroma and the kind of use of broken color. What does it take to manufacture this particular look? What has he had to do? What has he chosen to do? But that would be a reason to do this. Just to, for example, see how much intensity of color there is in this shadow. It's very easy to think there's no color in here. And I'm going to talk about that again when you get to Sorolla, but this is a classic moment when, this, as I've said, nothing like this has been done with this kind of magic before this. I'm talking about full spectrum light. It's not been done. And you don't just walk in the door knowing what's going to happen in there. And you go out to paint, and you're going to paint in mud. I mean, I was fully aware of this. I had been studied with an impressionist, and I was still incapable. But some of it would have been ameliorated by me having copied a section of a Monet that actually sang with light and was full spectrum. Just there are lessons there. Does that mean I want to be a little Monet? We've answered that, right? So now here's the Sorolla. Now this would be, it's handled in a different way. So this would be an exercise in understanding. You might copy this just to understand that, how dark. See, this skin is so dark. And most people want to paint skin really light because you're thinking sunlight. Right? Some of my students, maybe all of you at different times, maybe all of us. But here's this glossy highlight that you're not going to get if you don't paint that dark. And yet he's got all this life in here in the color. So you're going to have a lesson here about how dark, how much chroma you're going to need to paint dark enough to make these highlights blast, to make it look like water glistening off skin. So that would be an excellent section. Just copy a section like that and just get the hang of literally where he lives between black and white in the values world to get, and what it takes. You can't get rich notes painting around white. Those notes that's a whole different animal. So, you see what I mean? So you might be trying to figure out, so to understand that issue of what's the role of values, what's the role of chroma, to produce such and such an effect. Most of my students will start with the lights being, their default is white. And most people, I think. And maybe a passage like that right there, you'll just think, oh, this is just I'll just make it like white, and that'll be light. But if you think ahead, you know that if this is going to glisten, it's going to look like water is on the bodies. You're going to have a dark enough note to make that light pop, right? It's a highlight like on a bottle. So what is that thing, right? These are just wondering, looking, Now, maybe the time to do these kinds of copies is when you need it, right? You have a problem out there, you're painting outdoors, and you recognize that you're not resolving it. You're not getting the richness of the day. I mean, a lot of people tried, like in the Monet model, they tried to paint a painting like this, very, very, very pale. Try to use the same model and just elevate. Have you ever looked out the window and noticed that? I'm looking at one now, and notice that in the trees, every single thing out there is way lighter. The darkest darks out there are way lighter than my lights on my books inside the studio. There's nothing dark out there. So people want to paint in a high key through the whole painting. And yet this painting here, by the way he's handled intensity, full-bodied color, is getting that same sense of light. And how many of us really even understand that light, that the showing of color produces light? You play with neutrals, and you're really not going to be in that same world. You're not going to have the same sense of light. So just what do you want to think about? What do you want to use this guy for? And by the way, with anybody, you can actually use them to see how they handled something else, too, if you happen to like it over what you like with certain other people. So now, we talked, I think it was the last time, about the arabesque. So there are people who are really marvelous in expressing, that at times really produce marvelous arabesque. What I'm going to call an arabesque, but the great sweeping line of the abstraction of the composition, a dominating thing that flies through here. You see me doing this because all the lines going this way, but there's great sweep going through here. Everybody who's worked with me in composition knows I use this one as a model of the great line and the counter line, or even built out of this other line. Well, you could scribble this. You don't need to do massing here or anything like that, or you could do it with massing in blobs. But you want to understand this idea of the great line in a painting. And so you take a few pictures with great lines in them. Now, this is where I would separate and say, don't be taking so-and-so as the great line guy. Don't bother. Most painters have done this at least once or twice. So think about where the great paintings are that actually play this kind of a game or do great things with the great line. See the great unity of this one here, of the Corot. You see the sweep up here and the sweep here and this great sweep here, but you see it being from little to middle size to big. And you see even counter lines in relation to it, counter play in relation to this big sweep. I call that the wheel and the spokes, sort of a model. It's commonplace in painting. But you can scribble this without values. You can scribble the concept down. You can make a little rectangle. And you can throw those one line, the second line bigger, and the third line hooked more, and way bigger, and you can scribble that in a few strokes. You can actually see what so you can copy this effectually, that idea effectually with a few marks. And I highly recommend you do that with compositions that just blow you away like this, that are brilliant gesturally. Now, the spotting one is another issue. So who do you want to talk? You can always pick up Benson. Benson's a spotter, a bird spotter, I guess, huh? Actually, it's funny. Gammell was a bird spotter. And there's some fun stories. My wife and I saw a kingfisher down by the bridge not far from his summer place. And when we reported it to him, he insisted on being driven down there because he had never seen one in his life. And he didn't want to believe that we'd actually seen one, but it was sitting like right next to the bridge and it wasn't moving as we drove over Hopper Road and that little bridge up to his driveway. And but there's one of our friends did a cartoon of Gammell, and he's busy talking about something and painting, and all of a sudden his binoculars, which were hanging from his neck, if you watch him outdoors, critiquing, because he didn't want to miss a bird, and all of a sudden here's this picture of Gammell with this, all you see is his neck and chin and these goggles pointing up in the air. Nice job. I apologize for not remembering your name. If you've picked this up, I didn't have quite enough time with you to make it permanent with me. But nevertheless, we're talking here about what we call spotting. And you can also pick this up in just blobs. And I have done videos about these main elements of composition. But the distribution, there's this major dark here. You can see it breaking up, and then getting way out here and smaller and sort of trying to disappear out of the picture. You see that conceptually what that is, right? So you see pictures that do this. You see what the beauty it is in a particular picture. This is compositional stuff. What the particular beauty is, or the beauty is in a particular picture that really attracts you. Find ways to analyze it. But don't turn it into, sometimes you can copy them and it'll dawn on you. But I don't prefer that lack of mindfulness. There's a kind of to me, there's a kind of a stupidness to that approach. But by the way, and maybe it's just the way you must do it. Whatever it takes for you to get it is good. But this, you can see this as a picture, as a big middle tone picture. You can see the distribution of the blob of the lightest light right here, which is the weaker of the powers. And then the real game in town is these darks going spitter-spatter through the painting. You can analyze that with a charcoal. You see what I mean? Maybe a white chalk and a charcoal. I'd recommend you do it on brown paper and analyze pictures like this. Same thing with this one here. You see this great, the overall thing here is a great mass. So this is a mass analysis. So when these things are beautiful, I don't just copy every picture if it doesn't have these things aren't saying, making me say, this is amazing. What do you do? Look at this. So what you see here is you see a picture, again, very much like this one, where the lights read and play games, but they're secondary. The darks are the powerhouse. But the whole thing, you could argue, is sitting on a midtone, right? And I always say whatever it is, whatever is the greater amount of something is the first value. And the play then becomes of the lights here, and then primarily it's the dark. So powering up right out of here, and it rather sort of spirals out of here, right? Following a big sweep, and more, right? So you can follow that, and that's one of those things where you can see whether or not you think that's aesthetic. That's one of the things about good painting is that the artist didn't just spot it, but he spotted it with a sense of that gave you a pleasure, right? A delight. And that has everything to do with where and what, even the little tilts of some of these birds wind up being factors in that. But you still wouldn't go copying this to try to get the birds' beaks in the grass and necessarily, right? But for different reasons you would, but not for the reason of spotting. So the primary thing about this thing is there's a big value thing. Value starts, or there's a big value here, or you could say there's a big value right through here, and then out of it grows these darks that get more and more distinguished as they start flying away. In this case, it looks like they're coming in. Now, if you wanted to study figure grouping, this guy's your man. This combination here, and I want to show you the Greek vase in a second, but in fact, I'm surprised I didn't show you the Greek vase. I think I'll go to the Greek vase first because this guy comes straight out of the Greek vase. Let me do him actually. Let me just talk about figure grouping though, in the sense that you take a figure, this figure, and you get this one to lean into it and get this one involved in it, and you make a fun grouping. They group together in a way that tells a story. I don't think he's the greatest at that, but he's magical at this thing I'm calling pattern. He makes a really wonderful pattern out of the combination of 2 or 3 elements. And he does it sort of routinely, right? So this is a mural by Leighton, by the way. So would I copy this whole painting? No, but this particular one is really intriguing. That's a beautiful abstraction in the sense of what we call pattern. It's a figment of more or less a flat figure, right? That has, fascinatingly interesting players here, less busy points, the whole general sweep of what it does, starting little and growing fat and then ending up with the head up here with a sort of a dot up top. It's actually, this almost is as fabulous as a vase itself. This is a vase, right? It's a human vase, right? But that gives you that chance to study making patterns. And this does too. Ang recommends you look at the Greek vases. So, and I think he says copy them, study them, whatever. And there's tons of evidence that everybody did, from Leighton to Degas to most people. Ang for sure. But just look at the charm, of these. See, look at these lines here. Look at these lines. This is Degas 101, right? Or even the legs of the horses. Look how they're or whatever that is, cattle or whatever the people. or the legs of chairs and tables. But notice fascinating, the word interesting is the key word here. This is showing you how patterning can be really interesting. And notice how it all hangs together. This has a very nice lyrical flow, and I imagine it goes around the entire calyx or bowl, whatever this thing is. It undoubtedly does, like a wave. It probably waves its way around in it. And you'll see how you can understand how irregularly it does its wave. It doesn't try to do it perfectly, symmetrically, or anything like that. It's a similar thing here. The guy's using what to me would appear to be the bottom of beds or tables or something like, I guess something to lie on up there. And he's got a whole one here. He's got most of one here. And he's got another one broken in 2 bits. You see the variety. You could learn lessons about the variety. And this is not about table variety, but it's more about the visual thing. So they're squares, but they're moving. They don't sit there as squares and take the life out of the picture. He keeps having lots of variety in it. So, and in the way the legs work, you're just seeing just delight. These guys are so entertaining in the interplay of darks and the interplay of legs, whatever you want to call them, and in the overall sense of lyrical flow. Lyrical in the one sense of that word, right? This one's fascinating, isn't it? In a sense, you don't even care what it is. It's just a fascinating abstraction. That's I wonder to what extent that is an influence on Leighton in this one here. Look, see the hanging stuff. Maybe it makes me think of that. But isn't that a fascinating abstraction? This is, it gets you into that discussion about how to use pattern, pure silhouette. If you blur your eyes and you don't look in to see this stuff, you should see enough data in the strong silhouette to help you to know what the storyline is, what the illustration's about. There'll be enough. There'll be a sword sticking out, a snake coming out here, or whatever. Enough play down here for you to know their feet. And again, notice the way darks are used. The variety is always there. The darks are always interplaying with great variety. And notice. So that's what you would study here. You're studying that kind of stuff, which happens in pictures. You want to have been there with this kind of stuff, okay? Here again, the darks. This is like an opening in the darks. This is like an object against the lights. But they're still just dark play, right? And there we are, These plates are sometimes as magical as anything in the world of art, and especially in the 2D world, our world, the drawing, painting one. And Degas, as I said, is maybe we can end with this one, but Degas is a master. He's a student. He's a student of all aspects of painting. He's a great student of the masters. And I just leave you with these because if you want to really go deep into composition, this is the guy I recommend you try to think with, and do it every which way that he does it. I mean, what do you think when you look at this and you see these things dancing like this? Here's the Greek vase, right? Here's the lights dancing like this. And you back up mentally and you start seeing how there's a similar sort of activity here, a related activity, which you could say is also related to the head activity, or even the whole body activity. There's this whole great, again, lyrical, pleasing sweep through here. It's all of a piece, all done with very different ways throughout the different areas. No end to the possibilities. Think through composition with Degas. I don't think anybody ever spent more time, I should say that, spent more time in the painting as in its fundamental problem, the problem of what makes the music, what makes the entertainment. And so this thing about being interesting, copy his picture for no reason except to find out how it's interesting. I think most of what you're going to find out about him being interesting is going to be in the silhouettes. He says it's all silhouettes. So if you'll notice things like these silhouettes, and then this bumpity silhouette happening through here, these silhouettes, and these weaker silhouettes, and these silhouettes, you're going to start having, copy that with the idea of doing nothing but to play with the silhouettes and see what he's up to. You can see the Greek vase in this guy. And so it goes, right? And he's always entertaining in the sense of like he turns this guy's head into a cauliflower ear. He's always pulling your leg and having fun. He's turning this guy's fingers into legs up here, or you could say he's turning these fingers into dancing legs. But he's even doing it with these guys. What are these games? How would you copy this to get that, right? I still don't recommend you copy this stupidly, like from left to right or anything like that. I could expect, look, what do you got this guy in front of you for? Some of it may dawn on you just by copying mindlessly. But I try to get I try to get you to think or to observe what it is about this particular picture that you want to get your handle on. What has he got that you want to know that might contribute to your capabilities, to your, I'd say greatness, but I don't like the word, but to your mastery as a painter. And as I said, what I do like about Degas, he becomes a master draftsman, sort of, you might say, right up front. And then he does all this other analysis, spends his whole life analyzing composition, coloristically and many other ways. He explores the question of storytelling in the precise sense of the word, like the realism thing. I mean, some of the sordid tales he's telling, the absinthe and the others. So he walks through all these different things. He's a real explorer, but he in the same sense as Leonardo in his analysis of the visual impression. This guy's analysis of painting is unknown. There's nothing like this as far as depth goes. And so figure out what it is you want to copy for. And this is by no means definitive. We could go look at it. We could go talk about form as a thing. Copy some guys because of the brilliance of their form. Copy a section or two with brilliant form in it. I mean, you could learn a lesson just by copying the form of one ear on this Degas. But you're not going to hold your lesson well just by copying the whole thing. I suggest you go for something and study it and learn the lesson, right? You could go for this and just study the idea of form, about flat patterns, flat but turning forms or whatever, and big, soft, whatever. What play is there that you want to learn about? Or what way of handling, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, but also composition writ large, I mean, the great activity of, what's the main line of a picture? And how does he creating the counterplay? How does he create unity? So, yeah, I better end with that. I don't want to leave you with the idea that I don't think there's value. There's value everywhere. When I get to Degas, in a sense, he's the closest guy to us who's really turned over something that's changing everything. And doesn't change its form. The form's always been there. People have always done it, but he's thinking it through in his efforts. So that's the reason I put so much emphasis on it. All right. I don't think I have anything else. Yeah, that's what I have to offer you. So again, thank you guys for your comments and sharing and subscribing and all that sort of thing. Donations always appreciated, and I hope you can get some delight out of the copying the masters. I do recommend you copy them in person, but some things you can get from books on some level. But the more you can copy them in person, the better. And again, as I've said, the further back you stand with certain ideas, and then, of course, when you go to a section of a picture, I highly recommend you come up close and study it. The Boston School guys sent people to copy either sections of or whole pictures, Vermeer or Velázquez. Their students who'd done the 7 years program would be given scholarships, but they would be expected to send back studies. But one of them, it's just an example, was copied by a number of people, Ripley among them, is the figure of the spinner of Velázquez in the foreground of that picture of the Las Alondras. But others copied some of the Vermeers, I think whole. The one I have is whole, and I heard somebody else has a copy. I think Tom has a copy from somebody else that's also whole. So those pictures are so much smaller, it's a lot easier to do that. But if they didn't have a purpose in copying, their purpose in copying was to send copies back, to have done the finished part of their graduate work, I guess, to prove that they were worthy or something. I don't know. And I don't know where these pictures wound up. We found them on the street, so to speak. All right. But yeah, do copy from life. Copy if you can, as much as you can. Copy from life, and know depending on what you're trying to get from it, where you should stand in relation to the painting when you do it, and how much data you're going to put into it. I really recommend you don't follow a sort of a new realism model of just start drawing everything. I mean, that's not so many aspects of painting are going to be retarded. Things you should be studying, they're going to be retarded by that, and you're not going to get to it, and you're going to quit copying pretty soon. So you got to know the point. You got to get to the point and have a great time copying. Do it from life if you can. All right. Well, I wish you all a very good week, and I will see you, or I won't see you. You'll see me in the next one. All right.